welcome back to the third day of our session. Today we have three very exciting talks. They're 1 hour each with a break in between. And I think for format, I spoke with the presenters a little bit before, and this is what we'll do. Let's reserve the first and last 5 minutes of each talk for the presenters. And then whenever you guys have questions, if you're a panelist, just unmute yourself and ask. And if you're an attendee, raise your hand and I will unmute you. This way you can ask yourself and we can simulate the live conference environment as much as possible. So it's important for you to know that the presenters will not be able to monitor, they're not going to be monitoring chat or Q&A during the talk. So just ask out loud. Okay, so with that, let's get started. And it is our pleasure to welcome Tianyue to present her paper. And I will let you introduce your paper, Tianyue. You should start sharing screens now.
Okay, thank you. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, here's my screen. I hope that everyone has a clear view of the screen and also hear me talking. So I'm Tianyue Ruan from NUS here in Singapore. Today, I'm very happy to present this paper, collaborated with my colleagues Sumit, Wenlan, and Bernard on elderly support here in Singapore. We thank the organizers for including this paper in the program. And during my presentation, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to interrupt me. So our paper is broadly motivated by the widespread trend of increasing life expectancy and associated elder age financial insecurity. So the extended life expectancy means that people's retirement savings accumulated during their working years may not be enough when they step into retirement. And also there is this trend of rising cost of living and healthcare, which may exacerbate the problem of elder age financial insecurity. So this prompts governments to consider support measures such as direct fiscal transfers. So there are a lot of questions remain in this domain, even though people generally agree that support measures are needed. For instance, we don't know too much about how the elderly would respond to these support measures. Associated with this is that there are different subgroups in the elderly population, whether the support measures have relative differences in the effectiveness is also unknown. And lastly, in terms of policy design, there are quite a number of elements in designing an actual policy. We want to know what is a good policy in terms of eligibility criteria, payment frequency, and distribution form. So motivated by these questions, we study the response to a program here in Singapore called the Silver Support Scheme. It's a means-tested elderly support program. Here's a preview of our main findings. We find that elderly individuals increase spending by $0.7 per dollar of subsidy received. And this effect is stronger or more pronounced for those who are liquidity constrained. So liquidity constrained recipients exhibit a higher MPC, marginal propensity of consumption of 1, regardless of their income level. They also respond to these subsidies, which are recurring in a more speedy fashion. And we find no evidence of labor supply reduction or other strategic behaviors. So our findings have implications for the policy elements I described earlier, namely the eligibility criterion, payment frequency, and distribution form. So without further ado, let me tell you about what this program we study is about. So this Silver Support Scheme targets low-income elderly individuals by giving them a quarterly cash payouts since 2016. So every Singaporean who is above 65 is eligible to receive these quarterly payouts if they satisfy these three conditions. The first one is their total contribution to the national pension savings system, namely CPF, is lower than 70,000 Singapore dollars by the age of 55. So this CPF system has a compulsory contribution as well as compulsory contribution rate for working Singaporeans. So these first criterion amounts to a cap of pre-retirement cumulative income. The second criterion is low current income, including family support. So current monthly income per person in a household is lower than 1,100 Singapore dollars. Lastly, elderly Singaporean needs to live in a subsidized public residential housing known as HDB up to 5-room apartment. And the home ownership is restricted to even smaller HDB apartment. So as people who live in a subsidized public housing is generally less well off than those who live in private condos, this third criterion represents limited housing wealth criteria. Altogether, these three criteria means testing criterions covers the bottom 20% of the elderly individuals. So the distribution form of this scheme is a quarterly subsidy in the form of direct bank transfer, ranging from 300 Singapore dollars for those who live in the biggest eligible HDB apartment to 750 Singapore dollars per month for those who live in the smallest HDB apartment. So in total, the annual fiscal cost to the government is about 250 million US dollars as of 2019. So this is one of the largest fiscal spending programs that Singapore government is doing. So the quarterly subsidies starts in the quarter before the 65th birthday for an eligible individual and continues as long as he or she remains eligible. So for instance, if Ms. Tan turns 65 on May 13th, 2017, she will start receive the subsidy in the previous month, namely in March 2017. And the government would notify eligible individuals way advance of the first subsidy. So it is reasonable to assume that people, when they actually receive the money, is already expected payout. So next, let me talk about the data that we use to study this program. But before I talk about the data, if there's any questions, please feel free to interrupt me.
Let me just
cool.
ask a question. I want to know a bit more about the system.
Sure.
So is there any other kind of pension transfer before this subsidy program started? Say, I thought you're talking about monthly payment, but actually it's quarterly payment, right?
Quarterly payment, yes.
So if you think of quarterly payment, then the money is not that big. Hong Kong has something like that. They call it veg or fruit fee, which I think is actually a bit more generous than this transfer in Singapore. So I want to make sense of the magnitude of the transfer. This is add on to something already there, or it's the new. There's nothing like that before. There was nothing.
Okay.
Like that.
Okay, thank you. So as far as this demographic group we are talking about, elderly individual, this program, as far as we know, is the only program that has this form, which is direct bank transfers. There are other support measures, such as there are medical support measures, like elderly people, they generally can enjoy subsidized or discounted medical services, which are also funded by the government. But in terms of this direct bank transfer, which does not require additional, which does not have additional requirements besides those three criteria I just talked about, this is the only program targeting at this demographic group. Okay, cool. Thank you. Any other questions here?
Tianyue,
sure.
Is the bank card, the debit card that where the subsidy is provided, the same from the same bank that you have the bank transaction data?
So yes, we are using a bank transaction data from one of the largest bank here in Singapore. So we only in our empirical analysis, we only focus on those whose subsidy goes into the account in this bank. So you are right that some other individuals they may not use this bank, so they are outside of our sample. So we only focus on those who receive subsidy from the account in this bank. So, but we believe this is a rather representative sample because this is one of the largest banks here in Singapore.
So I had a quick question.
Sure.
In Singapore, there, I think a similar target group, low-income Singaporeans, not demographics, are also given GST vouchers, right? Which work very much in the same way, right? So how will you separate out these two effects?
So GST vouchers is basically, GST vouchers means that typically when a person make purchase, he or she needs to pay the GST, which is currently 7% here in Singapore, goods and service tax. And and GST vouchers means that you don't need to pay these 7% more of the price, but that has a restricted use in the sense that you do need to make certain purchases depending on what the GST vouchers terms and conditions are to utilize this subsidy. So in the later part of my talk, I actually want to point out the unrestrictiveness of the cash or bank transfers has on our effects. So I hope that I can defer elaborating more on this to the later part of my talk. Okay, thank you for your questions. Now let me go ahead to describe what data we use. So we obtain the data from DBS, which is the largest bank here in Singapore, covering 80% of our population. So we obtain a data set, comprehensive data set, covering a random sample of 250 individuals for 3 years period from 2016 to 2018. So we have information on their checking account transactions, including the amount, date, direction, inflow, outflow, as well as transaction code. So this transaction code is very, very detailed. It allows us to precisely identify the recipients of the Silver Support Program. And we also complement these checking account transactions with additional data on the ATM transactions, where we obtain the location of the ATMs where an individual withdraws or deposits money. So we also have debit card and credit card transactions where we observe the month, the amount, date, and merchant code. We have the statement information for all these accounts. Besides, we also observe a host of demographic characteristics, including age, gender, education, marriage, etc. So we construct the sample according to the eligibility criteria. As I have mentioned, this is direct bank transfer where the government just transfers the $750 per quarter to the eligible recipients. Each of these transactions are recorded with one designated transaction code, which is SSS, Silver Support Scheme. We identify these subsidy transactions and then impose additional filters according to the program eligibility criteria. So Singaporeans who have at least received one subsidy in our sample period and satisfy the age and HDB requirements in our sample. Altogether, we have 1,340 individuals in our sample. So here's the characteristics of these 1,000 plus people. So cash spending accounts for 70% of their total spending. Remember, these are elderly individuals. So it's reasonable to see that they primarily use cash and they do not use card or mobile payments that much. And I also want to point out that the credit card ownership is very low in this group, and none of them has any credit card debt. So now let me tell you about my empirical approach. So there is a mistesting that is employed to determine who can receive the subsidies. This means that non-recipients are not comparable or not a credible counterfactual for recipients. So we therefore restrict analysis to include only the recipients, which who are identified by this designated transaction code in our study. And our identification relies on the variation in timing of program inception. So different individuals, since they turn 65 at different point in time, they will start receiving the subsidies at different point in time. So here's the staggered inception of subsidies in our sample. So we can see that the earliest, the inaugural recipients, they received the subsidy at the time that this program starts in July 2016. And the last cohort we see here is the last quarter in our data, which is December 2018. So we do have this staggered start of quarterly subsidies in our sample. So using this variation in timing, please.
Can I ask, is the retirement age in Singapore also 65? The same timing as they receive the silver support?
Okay, that's a great question. So since we are talking about elderly individuals, we do need to talk about whether they enjoy the, when they retire. So basically, a lot of people do retire at 65 or before that. So the CPF I have mentioned, that which is the national pension system. So people can start withdrawing the CPF money at the age of 55, but it's staggered withdrawals. So at 55, they can withdraw a lump sum. At 65, 10 years later, they can start receiving annuity. So from the CPF, depending on the balance that they have left. So indeed, we do observe that many people would retire between these two brackets from age 55 to 65. Yes, so later I'm going to show you some results in terms of labor supply. So in our sample, these 65 plus people or these elderly individuals, a lot of them have already retired. In the data, we can see that, but still there are a fraction of them who are still working and receive salaries.
Do you know
the government officially make the retirement age 65 and was in the process of trying to move it up to 67. In our sample, the official retirement age is 65, it's like if you're in the university. But we are moving it up to 67 and contemplating to 69 and so on.
Okay, so I guess the reason I asked the question is that, in the retirement consumption literature, there is something called retirement consumption puzzle, right? There's a bit about typically 17% drop in consumption expenditure at the time of retirement. So if you don't know, for example, when they precisely retire or start drawing down CDF money, maybe that will be useful.
Okay. Yes, so that's a great suggestion. So we are aware of the life cycle consumption pattern, which typically documents a drop. I want to point out that we are looking at just a smaller age group. So we are looking at, let's say, we have 3 years of data. We focus on these episodes. So our identification comes from the time when the individual first starts to receive the subsidy, so which is a much tighter band. So if we ignore the silver support and just look at, let's say, from age 64 to 66 in the full sample of the bank data, we do not see such a big drop, unlike in the life cycle literature where people typically look at larger, which typically look at a longer horizon to see the drop. So this is what I want to say about this. But I think Hami raised a really good point. We can definitely think more about how to account for that in our analysis. Okay.
Tianyue, Joe Cherin here.
Sure.
Are you able to segregate the recipients by home ownership structure? Because I noticed they can, those who own homes up to 4 bedrooms, I think is what you said, as the criteria to receive or to be eligible to receive. So for those who own homes, I don't know if you have the data segregated by ownership structure, but those who receive homes presumably can enter into the Singapore version of reverse mortgage, which is lease buyback scheme. Which means they have less liquidity constraining boundary conditions, if you know what I mean.
Yes, yes. Thank you for raising. First, I want to point out that home ownership is restricted to at most 1 HDB apartment, which is at most 4 bedrooms. So these are people who either don't own any property or they own just 1 HDB property. So it's not condo. I mean, if they own a condo, they are not eligible. And second of all, I believe most of the people in our sample, they do own HDB. So the home ownership rate is quite high. But considering that these are subsidized HDB, we believe that this is a reasonable characteristic, reasonable summary statistics to see in the data. So we do not, we have not studied the reverse mortgage, whether they can cash out the housing wealth via reverse mortgage. So yeah, this is something we have not considered.
Okay, well, I'll tell you the facts. There's a lease buyback scheme, which is a Singapore version of reverse mortgage. And if they have ownership of the apartment, if they're living in it, they can monetize and get liquidity that way. Their reluctance to accept different issue, that scheme. But my point is that that's one way in which you can segregate or separate the liquidity constraint versus those who are not.
Okay, thank you for this suggestion. We can definitely take a look at the HDB owning people versus renting people to see whether along this dimension we have differential effect. Okay, thank you. So let me continue with empirical approach. So
can I also ask you what you can observe, what you cannot observe, just to clarify? So I mean, you talk about government the eligibility criteria. The actual CPF contribution is something you observe or you do not observe?
No. Thank you for the mapping.
It's the mapping between the money. So whatever government sends to the bank account, you do observe because your data is from bank, right? How easy it is to reverse engineer, the amount one receives from the government to whatever the value of the HDB apartment or the CPF contribution. Like, is there a tight? Is there like an explicit formula linking those stuff into silver support amount? Another question related to this is that potentially, if you observe something more than the government, in particular, CPF is only tied to labor income the government can observe. When someone has more than those like voluntarily saving outside CPF, as well as additional income, might show up in the bank account balance. But bank account balance, I understand, is not part of the criteria for government to determine silver support amount, right? So you also observe something that the government does not observe.
Yes. Okay. This is a great point. First of all, I want to say that the 3 criteria government announced and used, we do not have precise or perfect measurements. For instance, we do not know what is the lifetime CPF saving, this CPF contribution. This is something that only government observe. For the second part, the current family support, we can come up with a measure using the bank account transactions. And the third one, which is how big the HDB apartment is. This is only something government observes. We do know that whether a person lives in HDB or private condo, but we do not know how big his or her HDB apartment is. So for that reason, we do not have a precise formula to back out, according to the government's formula, who should receive the subsidies, who should not, or who receive or who do not in the population of individuals. That's why we only focus, that's why I only focus on those who have received the subsidy from the government. Because
do you have the formula? Do you have the formula mapping the three variables government use to the amount that government will give?
Oh yes, we do have the formula. This is again from the government. So so among recipients, so as long as you satisfy the three criterion, how much you receive is only based on the size of the HDB residence.
It's only based on IC, so not based on CPF.
Not based on CPF anymore. CPF contribution decides whether you can or cannot receive the subsidy. Once you satisfy that, how much you receive is based on how large your public housing unit is. So I guess from this information, we can back out the size of the HDB, which is something we have not pursued. I think is a good is another perspective that we can pursue. Okay, thank you.
Can you select into the treatment group, because there's a cutoff of 70,000 you said for CPF. Okay. So can you like strategically decide, that you're not going to top up your CPF and things like that? This goes back to the outside saving point that Shang Jinwei was raising.
Yes. Okay. This is something we are also considering. Whether we do know that a lot of these subsidy programs may be subject to manipulation, and I also have the same concern for this particular program we are studying. So our answer, we have some additional analysis to shed light on this. Our answer is that this program is not that easy to manipulate. The key is that the pre-retirement contribution is taken at age 55, but the subsidy only starts at age 65. If a person really wants to manipulate, he or she needs to be extremely patient to forego this 10 years difference in this and to actually manipulate into these programs. So we think that this CPF criterion, which is at the time of program inception at age 65, is pretty much predetermined because it's determined 10 years back, is very difficult to manipulate. So that's why we see that there's very little strategic manipulation in the data that we can see, which I hope that I can show maybe in the later part of the presentation. Thank you. So let me continue with the empirical approach. So we compare people who received the subsidy at one time with other people who received the subsidy at different point in time. So, and we run this panel regression. So the outcome variable is a measurement of spending. For instance, we look at dollar amount of spending, and then we later break it into different components. So pose is our key X variable. So it's one, since the person starts to receive the subsidy, we refer to this time point as program inception for these individuals. And the beta, which is the coefficient of this post indicator, measures the impact of the subsidy or on receiving a subsidy on daily spending. We have individual fixed effects, time, year of the month fixed effects, as well as day of the week fixed effects to remove, variations in other dimensions that may be confounding. And we cluster standard errors at the individual level. So here's our first result, which is the average spending response in terms of dollar amount. So we find that the silver support recipients increase their total spending about $7.35 per day. This additional spending, if we translate into, compare it with the pre-silver support spending, the increase is approximately 16%. And the bulk of this reaction comes from cash spending, which accounts for more than 80% of the additional spending. We see very little from debit card spending or credit card spending. The bill payment, which is payment for this recurring bill, also increase a little bit. So we can also express this number in terms of the marginal propensity to consume out of the subsidies. So to analyze this MPC, we modify the specification to relate the daily spending with the daily equivalent amount of subsidy. So basically, for every quarterly subsidy, we divide that by 90 to arrive at the daily equivalent subsidy amount. We find that the MPC is roughly 0.7, with the cash MPC close to 0.6. So before I move on, let me just briefly talk about the falsification tests. So we conduct several falsification to rule out certain alternative explanations. So because we are focusing on a very specific age cohort, you may be wondering whether there may be life cycle trends. So we first conduct analysis on matched non-recipients in the same age cohort as the recipients and with similar level of financial resources. So, and for using this matched non-recipient analysis, we find no result in this matched non-recipient analysis, and we conclude that the age-specific trends as an alternative explanation is unlikely to hold. And for the income-specific trends, we look at lower income Singaporeans that are younger than recipients. Because they are younger, they are not yet eligible to receive the silver support. In this matched young non-recipient sample, we also see a null result, zero spending effect. And using this, we can rule out unobserved income-specific trends. And we also conduct a bootstrap analysis to rule out the fact that the observed response is simply be random. So in the interest of time, let me skip this falsification and then show the dynamic spending response. So
can I ask a clarifying question?
Sure.
The cash consumption, does it include cash withdrawals?
Yes, cash consumption is based on cash withdrawals.
Okay, so but you don't know if that was, the cash withdrawal was spent on their own consumption or given to other members, right?
Yes, that's a weakness, or that's how cash withdrawals work. After they withdraw the money, we do not have a consistent measure of where the money is being spent. But we conduct one analysis, which is we look at where the ATMs that they withdraw the money are located, and we use the location of the ATM to try to provide more insight into what they are doing with the cash withdrawals. I think it's going to come up in 3 slides. Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Another question is, what would this silver support is perfectly anticipated, right? The people.
Yes.
Okay. So you would have thought that people will be able to, smooth, their consumption instead of having the pre-post kind of differences. And I think you will come later, but the balances of these accounts, right? So if they use the remaining balance of the account to as a proxy for financial constraints or something.
Yes. Okay. So yes, you are right. So because these silver support, the government notifies the eligible individual well in advance from a letter that you are going to receive the money starting from this quarter. So we think that is perfectly anticipated. So, rational theory would predict a consumption smoothing, but we actually don't find consumption smoothing. For instance, in this dynamic spending response, where we look at 3 months in advance of the first silver support subsidy, and we don't find anticipatory effect there. Our answer, our thought is related to liquidity constraint. We do find that more liquidity constrained people, they have a much stronger, a much faster response to the payouts. And we believe that this liquidity constraint is something that prevents people from better consumption smoothly. Okay.
So 2 questions related to liquidity constraint. Since the silver dollar grant is given once a quarter.
Yes.
Like, are you going to show us anything that's like a daily consumption pattern? Like, do we see most of the spending takes place a few days after the grant is issued, or do we see more smoothing over the quarter?
Okay.
The other question, related question is, do you know ethnicities of the recipient? Like, is there some interaction effects? So I lived in Philippines for 2 years.
Okay.
In Philippines, most people are paid twice a month. And you can see very clearly in shopping malls, the day after the normal payout, you're going to see a very long line outside restaurant, outside stuff, and the line gets shorter and shorter as the day goes by. A few days before the next payment comes, you can walk into a restaurant without reservation. There's no one's eating. So clearly people are extremely impatient or extremely liquidity constrained.
Right. Yes. Okay. It's actually coming. So first, let me just jump into this slide where we look at.
Do you observe ethnicities of the people?
Yes, we do observe the race. So there are like 4 major races here in Singapore. We do observe the race. We have not studied the interactions. I think this is something we can definitely do. But this is, I think this is the we do it weekly. So, but you can see the pattern. So this is the response to the recurring payment. So remember, these are quarterly recurring. Every quarter there is a payment. And I want to mention that the exact date of this payment is actually difficult to predict. So we have in the appendix showing that either the day of the month or the day of the week of the actual payment varies. It's not like it's every third of a month, which is more regular. So in our setting, the exact payment date.
Yes, yes.
So this means that people cannot precisely estimate the payment date, and therefore they cannot time the recurring payment that much. So given this fact, we look at how people react to these recurring payments. So we look at, we bundle in this weekly frequency. So we do see that the majority of these dynamic, weekly dynamic is concave. So the bulk of the spending response takes place in the first 2 weeks after a quarterly payment. So this is, yes, please.
I guess so I had similar questions to Hami and Shangjin, but my priors were the opposite, right? So you might think that they would just smooth consumption, but you might also think that they're sort of, they were particularly liquidity constrained in buying lumpy goods, right? Like they want to buy something and they have a little bit of money, but they're missing the full amount and they're credit constrained or they just don't want to borrow. So when they get the money, they go and just buy that thing, that one thing. Since you have very granular data, can you look at the expenditure, like the credit card bills, for example, to see whether that's happening? Like, are they buying one big thing, sorry, the debit cards, or is it like lots of little things?
Okay, yes, that's what we have in mind as well. So the graph I show here is total spending, bundling all the instruments together. So if we separate by spending instrument, cash spending follows the same pattern, where other instruments, the effect is not that pronounced, consistent with our average effect. And in terms of cash spending, we actually see that both the number of cash withdrawals and amount of cash withdrawals, both of these increase. So we think that it's more consistent with buying more of smaller things, because the increase in cash spending amount per withdrawal is there. You also increase a little bit, but it's by no means enough to finance a large ticket purchase. So we do believe that it's increased spending in the smaller things to answer these questions on what do they spend on in terms of this additional money.
I think for this group, for this income group, the meaning of a large ticket item can be quite interesting. Can be quite different than the wealthier people. for them, taking the family out, the grandchildren out for a good meal could be a large ticket item, and maybe that explains the beginning, the concavity of the expenditure, the MPC curve.
Yes, we do see that dining out expense goes up a little bit, which yes.
Yeah, so this is, I guess, the other thing that had me raised was about who the money is going to. And can you get at this by looking at heterogeneous effects? Like, do you have any demographic data? Like, do you see that the expenditure patterns differ if they have a big family, grandchildren, children?
Oh, yes, this is a great suggestion. We haven't looked at that, but I do believe that we can use the family, we can construct family size proxies to see whether the response is different. Yeah, this is something it's definitely something we should do. Okay.
Your data, that means your data allows you to link up couples, right?
No. So basically, linking family members in the data is quite difficult.
Oh, you cannot. But then,
yeah, I mean, but I think they are like a family status variables we can look at. It's not going to be a precise measure, but I think it can still give us some variation in terms of family status, which can help us explore whether the money spent on the elderly people themselves or whether the money may be spent with the younger generations in the family. So yeah, this is.
But the government eligibility criteria must take into account. They must look at both husband and wife together, right? The government yes. in deciding whether any given individual is eligible for the support. Government also look at the spouse CPF. And so right?
The second criterion is family support or current income average. So family current income per person in the household. So the second criterion is assessed by the government taking family as the unit. So they look at what's the average income that each person is endowed in the family.
That's what does government base this on? Based on tax returns or based on?
Yes, I believe they basically the CPF and the tax returns can give them that information. And another relevant point is that CPF can be used to purchase HDB and other expenditures, which the government also has record. But unfortunately, we cannot do the precise matching of family members in our data. We don't have that much information. But what we can do to follow up with Nancy's and your comments is to just look at family status of these people, which the bank has a record, and then see whether the effects are heterogeneous across people with different family status. So yes, this is something we can definitely do in our.
So the data, I think about like one source of a noise is that some of the people in your sample also have their spouse receiving the silver support money, and others do not have a silver support receiving spouse.
Okay.
At least it has not started, right? So there's a.
But Xiangjin, the first thing is that the measurement is the test is the income per capita, and it has to be lower than 1,000. So if you have 4 and each receives less than 1,000, you have 4,000. The second thing is that if all 4 are living together and all 4 receive, they will all receive the silver support. So
yeah, but the spouse, depending on the spouse age related to yours, right? So the spouse, even if your spouse is eligible, he or she may either have started or have before you or after you. So
yeah. So this is something we currently don't. Yeah, I think yes, we don't, because we cannot perfectly match spouses or family members in our data. This dimension of the measurement issue is something we have to deal with. Yes.
But I'm surprised. Wouldn't the bank know the address of the people in your sample?
Yes, the bank.
Can you use the information? Are you allowed to use the information?
We have the postal area, which each postal area is something like a couple. So let's say it's 50 buildings. So banks indeed knows more, but we don't have detailed address to match the people in our data.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Another way to I think it's hard to get at spouses. Another way to get at children or grandchildren is to identify dates of the year where you know that expenditures are needed, right? So like the start of the school year, families have to spend a lot of money on books and things like that. And even though it's anticipated, we know empirically people don't smooth. Expenditures are much higher, right?
Okay.
Like right before school starts. And I guess getting at families, including spouses, you can also look at things like Lunar New Year's, because that's a time when people are very credit constrained just because of the need to give presents.
Okay. Yes, thank you for the suggestion. We can definitely, like, following this line of reasoning or suggestions, we can definitely take a look at the timing of certain dates or times of the year that kids spending are more pronounced, to see whether the results are different. Yes, thank you. Okay, so here's basically the concave spending response that I have talked about. So within the first 2 weeks of receiving a subsidy, the consumption response is already more than 40% of the entire consumption response in the 3-quarter period. So now let me show you some of heterogeneity. So first, we do see that male and female recipients, their response is similar. When we break down by income and liquidity, we find that lower and higher income recipients, their consumption response is similar, whereas higher and lower liquidity recipients, they differ a lot in their consumption response. Lower liquidity recipients' consumption response is more than 2 times that of the higher liquidity guys. So to further tease out or separate the effect of income versus liquidity, we basically consider 4 groups. So 4 possible values of income and liquidity profile, and examine these 4 groups. So when we look at higher versus lower liquidity people in higher income group, we see that the difference is there. And the difference is also there when we zoom in the liquidity within lower income people. On the contrary, if we just fix the liquidity constant and look at the difference by income, we do see that income does not play as big a role as liquidity when we fix the liquidity constant. So in this heterogeneity analysis, we do see that liquidity plays a bigger role in explaining the magnitude of the consumption response. When we look at the shape of the response to recurring payments, we also see that lower liquidity individuals, they have a higher spending response relative to higher liquidity individuals. And the shape is also much more concave. So in the first 2 weeks, the lower liquidity recipients curve just shoots up and then stay relative constant. Whereas higher liquidity recipients, the shape is much more flatter throughout
apologies, can you remind us how is liquidity measured? Is it by
okay.
bank balance?
Sorry, I missed that. So liquidity, we use the ratio of bank balance relative to monthly income as reported by the bank. So it's balance over income. So
what do you do with retirees? Because with people with 0 income?
So okay, so first of all, the income that banks report, we believe that it's not just employment income, not just salary. It includes the investment income and so on and so forth. So we believe it's broader than labor income. But unfortunately, for those who do not have any income according to the bank's record, we cannot calculate this ratio. So we can use other measures such as whether the individual has a credit card to assess the liquidity. and the results are similar. But for this particular ratio we use for the main analysis here, we do require that the income is reported by the bank.
So what's labeled as low liquidity, are they also just low wealth? Are they also low wealth individuals? Like, is it, you can separate the two, or they are the same in your?
So because I think this is something we have to check. So because first I want to mention that there are people who are low liquidity but high income. So it's not the case that all low liquidity people are low income, but you are asking about wealth, which I have not checked. So I can also look at, just compare our liquidity measure with a measure of wealth to see whether low liquidity people are also just low wealth. But the fact that they are higher income people and income and wealth may be correlated, we believe that it's not the case. All low liquidity people are low income. There's still some variation. Sorry, it's not the case that low liquidity people are just low wealth. There's still some variation in wealth among the low liquidity people. Yeah, but this is something we have not checked, but we will check.
And can you just a nitpicking point?
Sure.
A lot of these people who own homes, again, comes back to home ownership. These low income people own homes, usually, especially if they have more bedrooms than they need. They usually rent their apartments, and I don't presume that they take, it's all cash. From what I understand, it's cash payments. It doesn't even hit the bank accounts. So it may not reflect their true liquidity constraints. You know what I'm saying? The bank balance may not be a sufficient statistics. There could be other sources of income, which I think another audience member brought up earlier. How do we know there's no other sources of hidden accounts or income?
Yes, so basically this is something I think that given that these side payments exist, there's no way for us to fully rule that out. I think I want to, for this, I think I want to share the rationale of this payment schedule, which is more payment for smaller apartments and lower payment for larger apartments. Already take these housing wealth into account. Your housing wealth, the person may be able to cash it out by renting out the extra room, or by taking a reverse mortgage, a higher payment from the reverse mortgage that you just mentioned. This is something that is considered to be housing wealth that is already determined in the payment, in the amount of payment that these people receive in these subsidies. So I think that it's difficult for us to fully rule out the side payments, as we don't have the data to capture the side payments of renting out.
Fair enough.
Yes, thank you. So I think I have 6 minutes. So let me show you the ATM withdrawal locations. So as I have mentioned, it's difficult to see what the cash is spent on because we lose track of them after they are withdrawn. So to shed more light on these cash withdrawals, we look at locations of ATMs that people have withdrawn money. So we can use, so here I show two analysis. First is sorting by the withdrawal locations, whether it's close to home or far away from home, and find that actually the bulk of the cash withdrawal increase is in the ATMs that are farther away from home. And second, we can look at the ATM withdrawals. They are closer to food courts. So, and we do see that the ATM withdrawals closer to the food courts also increase. So this is consistent with some of our earlier discussions where individuals are use the additional money from the silver support subsidies to spend more on dining out. So we are aware of the limited information we can extract from cash withdrawals. So we conduct a separate analysis on retail purchases using Nielsen home-scan data, where we have less clean identification because we do not know precisely who receive the subsidies, who do not, but we can still use the age and income indicators in Nielsen to conduct a difference of differences analysis of spending change. So we find that those who are plausible recipients in the treated group increase their spending, retail spending, especially on food items, and expand the variety of their consumption. So I think this increase of food spending is consistent with our earlier results using ATMs of these ATM withdrawals closer to food courts. So dining out and food spending increase. So lastly, I want to show that two another dimensions of the responses. The first one is labor supply. The second one is housing. So admittedly, we look at these people who are in their 60s, elderly people. So some of them have already retired, but we do see in the data that some of them continue working. They receive salaries, and we do know how much salary they receive from their bank transactions. We find that when we look at labor supply, whether we focus on the extensive margin where a person, individual receives salary, or the intensive margin, the log level of salary, we find no effect. So we think that this result is contrary to the notion that subsidies provide disincentives to work. And we also look at whether people change their housing. So remember, I told you before, if a person lives in a smaller apartment, he or she is entitled to a bigger subsidy each quarter. So you may wonder whether people may strategically downsize their residential properties to qualify for larger subsidies. We look at several indicators of residential moves, whether it's postal area or dwelling types, or the change of ownership status. So across these three measures, we find no results in either of these three measures of residential moves. We conclude that strategic downsizing is unlikely to take place in this setting.
So there's another way to look at the potential labor supply response to the silver support program. I assume there's a formula that will map someone's labor income into CPF contribution. And your bank, assuming someone, you people in your data always receive labor income at the bank account in your sample. Potentially, you can estimate CPF based on the income and accumulate those amounts, and to see whether whether there's a tendency for people, once they reach the threshold above which they will not be eligible for a silver dollar, people stop working or not. This is for poor income people, right? So that's something. I mean, it will require you to ask the bank to get you data, history of the people's income. But that data is something that the bank potentially has, right?
Yeah, I think that in terms of past. Okay, so I think in terms of past income, I think the bank do have some data, but I think I'm running out of time. But let me just say that the CPF criterion, the first criterion, is assessed at the age of 55, 10 years earlier than the
yeah. So I'm saying exact people would people stop contributing to CPF even before. There will be even bigger negative consequences of the program if people stop working around age 55. There will be even even worse for the program than otherwise.
This is something we can definitely do. We have not done that. I think in our implications, we have looked at people 2 years before they turn 65, where we look at whether they strategically reduce labor supply or change housing in the 2 years before 65. But I think what we can apply the same analysis to people before 55. Let's say we can look at people age 53 to 55 to see whether they actually adjust their labor supply to qualify for the CPF criterion, to strategically qualify for the CPF criterion, which is assessed at 55. That's something we have not done, but we can definitely do that. not for these people, that these recipients, but we look at younger people in the sample, a different sample of younger people, to see whether those who are on the margin to qualify for the CPF criterion may strategically do so before age 55. I think this is something we can definitely do. Okay.
But Tianyue, you need to conclude, and then you can take more questions during the break.
Yeah, I think I pretty much cover all the grounds. So let me just conclude. Okay, so in this paper, we focus on how these low-income elderly individuals respond to a retirement support program. We find an average MPC out of subsidies of 0.7, and this effect is more pronounced for those who are liquidity constrained, regardless of whether the liquidity constrained people income level is. They also increase spending much more immediately after the recurring subsidies. We find no side effects on labor supply or housing. On this last point, we can definitely augment the analysis to look at people before 55 to see whether they manipulate labor supply. I think overall, means testing criterion need to be carefully designed to deter strategic behaviors. So for instance, we believe the age 55 CPF assessment, since it's predetermined at 65, we believe this is a criterion that is very difficult to manipulate. We can definitely do more analysis on that. We also document that people do not appear to be smoothing their consumption much. So we believe that frequent payments and these cash and bank transfer disbursements will facilitate consumption smoothing. So I mean, in the interest of time, I don't have time to talk about the distribution form. If there's interest, I can talk more about this in the discussion. Thank you very much for your time. I'm sorry that I go over time a little bit. I'm happy to take additional questions here.
Okay, thank you so much. So that is the official end of the first session, but the room will be open for during the break, so you guys can keep talking. We will come back in 13 minutes at 9:45 a.m. Singapore time for our next talk, Golden Ages, A Tale of Two Labor Markets, presented by Heming Fang. All right, see you guys in a little bit.